because I think this compendium is incredibly important. And, as we're talking about trade, it's part of a broader global economic question. What works? Do market economies and democracy still work best to help promote opportunity and bring people out of poverty into the middle class? I think yes. I think that's being challenged right now. And I think particularly it's being challenged in the context of China and a different approach that they are taking towards economic freedom and ultimately political freedom. But I think the United States needs to continue to stand strong for human rights and for economic freedom and for democracy and political freedom. And so, even several years ago, that might not have been necessary to even say that. But today, I do think there's a debate going on, not just here in this country, but around the world, particularly among developing countries, as to what model they might aspire to. Terry has a great background as an ambassador to the United Nations, his work at the State Department, in addition to being author of this Index of Economic Freedom, and I appreciate him having me here today. I think it's a timely discussion. There's lots going on with regard to the trade agenda, lots of balls in the air. I have said publicly and privately to the administration sometimes too many balls in the air because it's difficult, having been a U.S. trade representative, sometimes to make progress on agreements when there's so much going on. And I refer you to really 4 different prongs of the current trade agenda with the administration. One, of course, would be the Section 232 issue that was talked about here. That's the exemption, really, to our trade laws for national security purposes. It doesn't require showing any unfairness in trade. It doesn't require showing that there is an influx of imports. It doesn't require showing domestic industry being harmed. It is the ability under a section of the GATT and now the WTO to be able to say, based on national security concerns, we want to put tariffs in place. It's only been used really twice since its inception, which goes back to, I think, 1963. Both was with regard to oil. Both was in the 70s, one with Iran, one with Libya. And yet it's being used today with regard to steel and aluminum tariffs. That's the 25% tariff that's talked about, applied to the entire world. Some countries have gotten exemptions from that, including Republic of Korea, as was mentioned. There's sort of a standstill with the EU on it. And then under the U.S.-Mexico agreement that was just announced, this is the update on the NAFTA, there is talk about having the 232 not apply there. But this is in my view, a misuse of 232, and that's why I have introduced legislation to kind of bring it back to its original purpose, which is true national security. In the case of the 232 on steel and aluminum, as you may know, the Department of Defense, it's now known publicly, did not support the national security basis. By the way, the same happened to George W. Bush when he came into office, talking about putting steel tariffs in place. Originally, he had talked about using this 232, the national security exemption. And as you will recall, Terry, the Commerce Department, which has the responsibility for determining a national security threat, did not go along with that. They indicated this was not a national security issue. So he ended up using another part of our trade laws, Section 201, as I recall, with regard to putting tariffs in place, which were short-lived. But the point is, 232 has not been used traditionally as it's being used now. And that's why I think it's important to bring it back to what was intended back in the 60s, which was true national security situations. And specifically, our legislation would say 2 things. One, that the Defense Department, the Secretary of Defense, would make the determination. They have the expertise, after all, to determine what is a national security threat and what is not. And again, in this particular instance, our understanding is that there was not agreement from DOD as to the 232 application to steel and aluminum. And then second, it says that with regard to the remedy, yes, Commerce would have the responsibility there, which I think is appropriate, but that it would have the opportunity also to go back to Congress with a motion of disapproval, should the Congress disapprove, to go back to the constitutional underpinnings of our trade policy, which is ultimately that Congress has the responsibility for commerce between nations. So we think our legislation is appropriate. It is bipartisan. We are hopeful that that legislation can have a hearing and have a markup, and that we can narrow the way 232 is applied, because I think misusing 232 has 2 potential problems. One is the fact that if we proceed with using 232 in this way, I think we will be taking away that tool in the future. Why do I say that? I believe there will be cases taken to WTO that will be successful ultimately. There was one years ago with the European Union and us. It was settled. But in this case, if it's clear that there are not national security reasons for the application, I think it's possible that the WTO exemption for this might be taken away altogether. And I think it's an important tool to have in the toolbox in the case of true national security problems. If you were to have a war and you were to need, for instance, the ability to avoid other countries from depleting, say, our steel and aluminum industries in order to provide the resources you needed for that conflict, that would be a case of national security. Second, I think if we continue to apply it in this way and not base it on fairness, what will result is exactly what we have seen already, which is other countries saying, great, that's fine. The United States is going to put in place these tariffs without any indication of unfair trade. In other words, no indication of them sending us exports that are sold at below their cost, which is called dumping, or subsidizing, which happens, by the way, quite frequently with some countries. And when that does happen, the United States has laws to deal with that again are laws that are appropriate under the international rules, under the WTO, anti-dumping laws, countervailing duty laws. But other countries are going to say, well, if it's not based on fairness, you can just put tariffs in place for any reason. Fine, we're happy to do that. And because it's sometimes quite popular to do it, from a populist point of view, that could lead to, which again you've seen with some of these countries, an escalation of tariffs. So when we put the 232 against Canada with regard to steel as an example, I think the amount was about $23 billion. They in turn immediately put tariffs on some of our products, about half of that, I think about $12 billion. And that included, by the way, agricultural products from Ohio, my home state, manufactured products from Ohio, my home state. And you had this escalation of tariffs, which ultimately is not good for the economies of either country, certainly not good for consumers. So I think those are the two risks you run when you say we're not going to use our trade laws. And fairness is in the eye of the beholder to a certain extent. I get that. But when you go through a process to determine what's fair and what's not fair, for instance, dumping or subsidizing, or a surge of exports to the United States, meant to destabilize an industry and then proving that industry is materially damaged, which is what the International Trade Commission and the ITA are responsible for determining. The Commerce Department and the International Trade Commission both have those responsibilities. If you go through that process, you've shown some unfairness, a lack of a level playing field. And I think that's what our trade policy ought to be based on. And Terry and I may differ a little bit because he's more of a pure free trader. And I'm not. Having been at USTR and representing Ohio, which is a huge manufacturing state, I do understand that at times it is appropriate for us to make that determination of what is fair and what is unfair, and in turn, require that level playing field. And ideally, what you end up with is a situation where both countries agree to back down. So in other words, rather than raising tariffs on our side, having the other country raise tariffs, which harms both countries' economies and the consumers in both countries, you want to go down to the lower level. And the United States, frankly, is a relatively open and free economy. Our tariffs are relatively low compared to other countries. There are some countries that have even lower tariffs, but they're the exceptions. But we should be encouraging every country in the world to adopt the lower tariffs, the lower barriers, but to do it in a fair way. So what the administration has done is, one, pursue this 232, which we talked about. Second, they have renegotiated NAFTA, so it's an updating of NAFTA. That's the U.S.-Mexico agreement, the USMCA. I think they could have found a better acronym. I call it USCMA, which just trips off the tongue, doesn't it? I mean, it's just a beautiful, beautiful acronym. But anyway, USCMA is the second one, and I'm delighted that we reached an agreement with Mexico and Canada, by the way. Again, representing Ohio, we did have some concerns with the existing North American Free Trade Agreement because it hadn't been updated in 24 years. and it was time to do it. Things like electronic commerce as an example, but also on other issues where there needed to be some changes on the labor and environmental side and so on. So it was sort of brought up to speed with other agreements. There are other aspects to it we'll talk about in a second. But that was an initiative which, again, with so many balls in the air, my concern was we would probably take too much time to get that resolved because we were distracted by so many other things. And it did take too much time, in my view, but we got there. And so now we have this new agreement that has been decided on. It won't be voted on by Congress until next year because of the amount of time it takes under our trade promotion authority in Congress. I would say there's one small caveat, which is you could, if Congress agreed, you could expedite that process a little bit and try to do something before year end, but it would be very difficult to do that. But that's possible. But more likely it comes up next year. So you have 232, we talked about. You have the U.S.-Mexico new free trade agreement between the North American countries, which is very important. By the way, for Ohio, our biggest trading partner by far is Canada, by far. Second is Mexico. China's a distant third. So for us, it's incredibly important to have that in place. Third, I would say it is rebalancing trade with China. And that's the Section 301 case against China. That's different than 232 because it is based on a sense of fairness or unfairness. Now, the WTO may well step in at some point, as they have in the past, and say that the 301 is not properly being implemented. But the fact is, if you read that 301 case against China, it's very specific as to what we're asking for. And it does have to do primarily with intellectual property. So it has to do with hacking, it has to do with licensing agreements, it has to do with joint venture requirements, it has to do with things where China is not playing by the rules. In other words, it's not a level playing field. If a Chinese company wants to come here, by the way, and set up a company, they're free to do so, and they do it. But the same is typically not true with regard to U.S. investment there, as an example. And the intellectual property that is often taken in this process is then used not just in China, but often comes back here to this country to be used, again, unfairly, in the sense that we have intellectual property laws in place to protect whether it's manufacturing processes or patents or trademarks. So that's what that issue is about. That one, again, would be great if we could have some resolution. What I have promoted there is that the administration do a better job of laying out clearly what their objectives are, because my sense is that China's not sure. Now, having negotiated with China when I was U.S. Trade Representative, they're very good negotiators. And so when I meet with the Chinese ambassador about this issue, as I have recently, and they say they're confused, what are our objectives, I point them to the actual petition, actually the trade case itself, which again is very specific. But it's not just about buying more soybeans, although that would be nice. We sell a lot of soybeans to China from Ohio, and we appreciate that market. But it is about structural changes in their trade relationship as a mature trading partner now, and as an export-driven economy. We're simply saying they should play by the rules. I met this morning with the presidents of the major research universities in America, as an example, and there's a concern about Chinese access to intellectual property through our research, as one example. So that's the third front. The fourth front, I think, is actually very exciting, and that is more trade opening agreements. So you've heard recently from the U.S. Trade Representative that they're interested in opening up new trade agreements, potentially with the EU, with Japan, with the UK. I started a group last year on UK, maybe it's earlier this year, a caucus when the Brexit vote occurred, that said that we would like to have a free trade agreement with the UK as they exit the European Union. I think that's an important first step toward a broader EU agreement, because we have the ability with the UK to put together an agreement relatively quickly. We have very similar approaches to trade. We have relatively low tariffs. We have the opportunity to change some of the standards to make them more uniform, as an example, and to really improve trade between our two countries. So my hope is that we'll be able to do that. But anyway, that's exciting to me. By the way, with trade agreements, sometimes they get criticized, including sometimes by our commander-in-chief. And I've talked to him about this issue, so I'm not saying anything I wouldn't say to him publicly and privately. But you have to look at our trade agreements and be objective as to what the result has been. And that is, good for exports and good for American workers and American farmers. So are all the agreements perfect? No, no agreement's perfect. And did we need to update NAFTA? Yes, we did. It was appropriate that we did so. However, we only have trade agreements with about 10% of the global economy. In fact, it's less than 10%, but let's take 10%. But think about it. We don't have a trade agreement with Japan. We don't have a trade agreement with the EU. We don't have a trade agreement with China. We have trade agreements with some important countries like Mexico and Canada. But the largest economies, we don't have a trade agreement. Where we have a trade agreement, which is about 10% of the world, about 20 countries, we actually have a trade surplus. Barely, but we have a trade surplus. 10% of the world actually accounts for 47% of our exports. So 47% of our exports go to less than 10% of the world. Those are the countries with which we have a trade agreement. Now, in the context of a trade deficit of about $500 billion, to have a trade surplus, slight trade surplus with these countries, is significant, and we should think about that. So as important as it is to have balanced trade, as I call it, and that is to have this level playing field, and again, a pure free trade position, as Terry explained eloquently earlier, would say that balanced trade is not as important because ultimately consumers benefit more from just open trade without worrying about the balance. But from that perspective, I think it's really important that we open up more markets. And that's why I'm excited about, again, their interest in moving ahead with a UK agreement, moving ahead with a broader European Union agreement, moving ahead with an agreement with Japan, which would then bring us in more to other countries, obviously in the Asia-Pacific region, which would be good with regard to our continued economic competition with China, to have not just a bigger footprint in that region of the world, but also to help develop some of the standards so that they are based on market economies and knocking down barriers and transparency, all the things that we know will lead to better economic growth in the Asian Pacific area. So those are the four areas that they're working on, and they're all really important. By the way, since we're talking about autos today, in part, they're all really important to the auto industry. Because you think about it, our auto industry is a huge industry here in this country, but also a huge export industry. Ohio, by the way, is the second largest automotive state in the United States, both by vehicle output and also by the number of jobs we have, about 100,000 auto workers in Ohio. We're also the #1 producer of engines and transmissions in the country. Take that, Michigan. So I'm co-chair of the Senate Auto Caucus. I'm from a big auto state, and I think it's absolutely critical that we do all we can to support and grow this industry that's so important to our state. And again, I think this two-pronged approach, one, being sure that imports are fairly traded, and two, aggressively opening up markets overseas, works perfectly for the auto industry. For those of you who don't know it, the auto industry is our single largest export sector. And this is a surprise to some people who think it might be soybeans or the ag sector, but nearly 1 in 5 American-made cars and light trucks are being sold overseas. So the Jeep plant in Toledo, Ohio, sends Wranglers overseas. And so it's important to have access to these foreign markets. In fact, it's vital to the health of the auto industry, just as it is to our economy as a whole. Just like everything else, as I said earlier, the auto industry does face unfair competition. Again, this one where I may differ from some in the room, but currency manipulation is one of them. When a country purposely manipulates its currency to have an effect on trade, it hurts our ability to sell cars overseas. And I would use Japan as an example of that. Japan has intervened in its currency markets 376 times since 1991. And by the way, foreign import penetration in Japan is less than 6%. And the U.S. penetration is far less than that. Now, that's partly because of currency manipulation, partly it's for other reasons, some of which are related to trade, some of which are not. It's not the only reason. Standards and technical barriers are one way that countries, including Japan, box out American auto exports. Some countries won't accept the federal motor vehicle safety standards, making it really difficult, if not impossible, for American cars to be on their roads. That's, in a sense, a protectionist approach, but hidden as a standards issue. I'll give you one example. Colombia and Ecuador recently tried to restrict the American safety standards in favor of European standards. And USTR, to their credit, recently was successful in having those countries revise their regulations to protect that market for U.S. vehicles. But as we open new markets, we need to ensure that our trading partners do respect our laws and play by the rules, instead of deciding to subsidize certain industries that are favored by them. And we need to be tough but fair with regard to countries that cheat. We need to have a level playing field. By the way, if we do that, I believe American businesses and workers will be fine. Yeah, there are some countries that are going to have a competitive advantage on labor rates, as an example, but we have a competitive advantage on other things, including energy costs now, including our research and development here. And I think if it's a level playing field, we can compete and we can win. And by the way, American workers believe that too. We have legislation that I introduced in 2015 that's working to do just that. We called it, very creatively, the Level the Playing Field Act. It's actually working to make it easier on the front end for workers and for businesses to win cases before the International Trade Administration. Basically saying that let's expedite these cases, get them decided quickly so that when something is dumped, sold at below its cost, or subsidized, you don't have to wait so long that your company goes out of business or you lose a lot of your workforce to resolve the issue. I also co-authored what's called the Enforce Act in 2016, which helps on the back end. So the front end is the Level the Playing Field Act, but the back end is, okay, once these tariffs are in place because of unfair trade, how do you ensure that they're actually implemented? Because countries and companies, foreign companies, try to evade those tariffs. And so we need to have a more, again, a stronger enforcement effort to ensure that there is a level playing field, both on the front end, but also on the back end, to make sure new duties are actually being enforced. So those are things that are going to help with regard to trade and keeping it fair. On the NAFTA agreement, because it was talked about earlier, 24 years ago, we had more auto jobs in America, obviously, when NAFTA was first written. It's for a lot of reasons. Some of it is automation, for sure. Some of it is the implementation of technology to make the production more efficient. But it's also interesting that we have lost about 350,000 auto jobs, while Mexico has gained about 430,000 auto jobs since that time. That's a fact. Now, it doesn't mean that all that's because of unfair trade again, but I do think that some of the aspects of the new USMCA are going to help. And I think specifically, and it was talked about the percentage that has to be made in North America to apply for tariff-free treatment. Again, I may have a difference with Terry on this, but the idea is you have this agreement between these three countries, and if you want to take advantage of the lower tariffs between these countries, then you don't want to have cars coming in and being sold essentially from, let's say, China or Japan into Mexico, and then without having a lot of value add to that car, have it be sold into this market and take advantage of the market when we're not getting the same advantages in Japan or China for our products. So the idea is to have an agreement that actually works between these three countries. So there was, 24 years ago, a 62.5% requirement that the value of the vehicle, 62.5% of it, or auto part, had to be made in one of the three countries to take advantage of the agreement. This new agreement ups that to 75%. So I know the auto companies are going to be talking later today. They can talk about what they think about that. But my sense is that most of the auto companies, the big three, are okay with that. They were not okay with some other aspects that were discussed in the agreement, nor was I. But I think we resolved something there that actually will work for the U.S. auto workers and U.S. auto companies. For the first time, these new rules of origin will require 70% of the steel used in the vehicle be North American steel. And again, pure free traders will say that's not appropriate. I would say this is an agreement between our three countries, and I think it's appropriate that steel be produced as much as possible within those countries, given what's happening with regard particularly to China, where they have an enormous overcapacity of steel production. They've gone from about 15 years ago producing 15% of the global steel to about half of the global steel today in China. They don't need it. So they send it out to other countries. There's a glut. And they often sell it below its cost. And some of it comes to our country, some of it directly, some of it indirectly, most of it indirectly, frankly, from other countries. So you want to avoid that issue in order to, again, establish what your fairness standards are. And we can disagree or agree on that, but then have those standards be applied. So that's part of The changes you'll hear about today from the auto industry, I want to hear from them too, see what they think about it. But I think in the end, we ended up with an agreement that provides some stability and predictability. And I think perhaps most important for me, there is talk about now applying the 232, this is the national security waiver we talked about at the outset, to autos. So recall I said that with regard to steel and aluminum, I think we need to have a level playing field, but we got to be sure that it's based on some sense of fairness. And again, there can be a debate on that, but let's determine what that is, not just based on national security when it's not a proper use of national security. There is discussion of now saying we'll do that to autos as well, as we have with steel and aluminum. I would suggest, again, balanced trade. You know, let's be sure it's fair. Let's aggressively pursue our trade remedies and trade enforcement. But let's not apply 232 to car imports from places like Canada, where we don't have a national security concern. In fact, what we have is a supply chain that goes back and forth from northern Ohio and Canada constantly, as an example, back and forth with parts and so on. And so I think using that 232 would be a mistake with regard to autos. Now, in the agreement, the U.S.-Mexico agreement we talked about, USMCA, there was a side letter that basically gives Mexico and Canada a safe harbor on 232 on autos. In other words, that they now don't have to fear the application of the 232 as is being threatened. And I think that's really important. And in some respects, that may be the most important part of the agreement in terms of the future stability of the car industry in America. And again, you'll hear from some experts on that. They're nodding their heads. That's good, because they're the ones who have to deal with this every day. And I think they're looking for that predictability and that safe harbor. So I'm glad that happened. And again, I think it's a mistake for us to misuse 232, whether it's on autos or other products, for all the reasons we talked about earlier. We may well lose the tool altogether. We are going to see higher tariffs being happily applied to our exports of agricultural, manufacturing, services, goods and services. So I do hope that we'll be sure that we are sticking to our fairness standard. By the way, if you did apply 232 to autos, the best estimate I've seen is that it would increase the cost of making a car in America by about $2,000. And they may have higher numbers today, because I know there's some that believe it would be even higher than that. There's another study saying it could cost 624,000 American jobs. That seems high, but on the other hand, let's hear from the experts. So this has real consequences in terms of my state of Ohio and our country and our consumers. I would say that autos help run our economy. They don't run a national security risk. And again, that's why we've introduced this legislation called the Trade Security Act, which takes us back to the original intent with regard to how the 232 ought to be applied. Finally, with regard to China, I will just say there are lots of issues. We talked about the intellectual property issues earlier. Republican and Democrat administrations alike have tried to deal with China on the trade issue to get China's attention. And frankly, China continues to violate and circumvent our trade laws in so many respects. I hope that the administration's latest actions will get their attention, but I hope we can resolve it, because I hope they'll be clear about what the objectives are, and they'll be based on a sense of fairness. On automotive, just quickly, we talked earlier about China's interest in acquiring more technology. They've been consistently acquiring American automotive technology. They require a joint venture for auto production. So if you want to make a car in China, it's got to be a joint venture. And the non-Chinese investor, the U.S. company, is capped at 50%. Usually it's 49%, 51% Chinese owned as a maximum for the foreign investor. And through that, they have acquired information and technology. And it's made it harder for foreigners to invest in autos. Before 2010, China encouraged the manufacturing of automobiles. Then they permitted it from 2010 to 2014. This is U.S. companies there. Then in 2014, they restricted it, actually in 2015, to bolster its favored Chinese companies. So we've gone from encouraging having companies go to China. I remember being there in the 1980s, mid-1980s, when Jeep first set up a factory there, and it was being encouraged at that time. Getting the technology was important, and having the jobs. Then they permitted it, then they restricted it. And so For electric cars, China has put barriers on other countries' exports to pressure foreign companies to bring technology there for manufacturing. The result is now nearly 500 electric vehicle producers in China. And I think soon these Chinese electric vehicles will be arriving here in this country. And what we're seeing with electric cars is right out of the playbook they've used with regard to steel overcapacity. We know how the steel overcapacity has turned out. Overcapacity has hurt our steel industry and other steel industries around the world, which again is why this trade enforcement is important. So I do think we have to resolve these issues, and they're tough issues. And again, look forward to hearing from the companies today as to what they think about autos in China. I will say that American ingenuity and assembly line automobile manufacturing is what made owning cars possible for everyone. I still own and drive a 1917 Model T. And so I think about it every time I drive my Model T. Wow, this thing's 100 years old. And it was made right here in America. And that technology is something we want to be able to maintain and then to use so that other countries can benefit from it around the world. So I think ultimately it's about this two-pronged approach, this balanced trade approach. One, enforcing our trade laws to ensure that imports coming in are not unfairly traded, and doing so aggressively, but on the basis of fairness. And then second, expanding markets. So important. And again, I think our trade agreements are an example of that, and I think we should do more of them. And if we do so, then American workers and American farmers, American service providers are going to benefit. Thank you all for having me here today. It's great to be back.